Greetings. Making a video from Singapore, a beautiful country. I've had a wonderful conference here, and I just wanted to kind of share some of the things that I kind of learned that kind of pertain to what we've been talking about. Um, so, as you know, it was a 3-day conference. Combination of scholarship on the short story and then also writers of fiction, of short stories, sharing their work and their perspectives on writing and so forth, and literally kind of alternated each day. You'd have a session of scholarly panels and a session of writers doing their readings and so on. And of course, there were special programs and special lectures kind of mixed in there. Very intensive 3 days. I mean, it was great fun, but it was also exhausting. It basically went from sun up to sun down, which is a long darn time here in Singapore because it's just 1 degree north of the equator. So the days are roughly equal between night and day, so about 12 hours a day of conferencing or whatever. But anyway, it was wonderful. Multinational group of writers, largely from Asia and Australia and Europe. Not too many folks from the U.S. here, so that was kind of cool to be among a very small contingent in this really large group. We're almost done. We have the kind of formal luncheon today, kind of the farewell luncheon, and then we're going to take a tour of a walking tour of a district in Singapore that is kind of the Muslim district, which has a lot of Malayan culture and shops and restaurants and cafes and so forth, apparently. So we're really looking forward to that. But what I wanted to do really was to kind of just go through the program and I've just kind of made notes about things that I might want to share with you that kind of foster some of the things we've been talking about all session, and maybe just some new information as well. The opening kind of speech or lecture or whatever you want to call it was about the history of the short story in Singapore, and it's a long and rich history. And what particularly caught my attention, given our focus, since this is a class in the Classic Sci-Fi and Horror, was the tradition of the ghost story in Singapore, and something that's been popular all along and is still very popular. One of the series that is very popular is about has an editor, but then also has a team of ghost writers, pun intended, and it's a bunch of writers who just write ghost stories and maybe some other supernatural things, but I think mainly ghost stories. And then they also invite readers of the series to submit their ghost stories, so some of those end up in each issue. So it's a combination of these professionally written stories with contributions from readers, and again, apparently very, very popular and very, long-standing and still very strong, etc. So that's interesting. Of course, I've known that throughout Asia, various cultures, supernatural, elements, ghost stories in particular, are very, very prevalent. One of the fascinating panels I went to was by a Japanese scholar, and she was talking about supernatural elements in Charles Dickens's work, and she talked particularly about the a Christmas Carol, but some other Dickens work as well. But it was very interesting to hear her perspective, since she comes from this this Japanese tradition of folktale and supernatural stories, and then what she was seeing in Dickens's classic ghost stories and so forth. So anyway, that was a part of the opening day. Again, this is kind of very informal. So as you know, I did a couple of things here. I presented a paper on my idol, William Gass's theories about narration and so forth, and that went very well. It was it was a nice sized group of writers and scholars who attended that, and we had a nice little talk about that afterwards. Some of them were familiar with Gass, many of them had no idea who he was. So I was happy to be able to introduce him to readers and again scholars who may never have encountered his work before. And then I also read a short story, Oxen at the Well, which was published maybe a year and a half ago by Roy Fonniant Literary Press. But it's part of my novel, which is still forthcoming. The novel is completed, just kind of looking at different options for publication. But the novel is The Strophes of Job, and Oxen at the Well is one of the strophes. But that was, seemed to be pretty well received. It has some interesting, comments and discussion about that afterward, and so on. So the other thing, or another thing that was really interesting on day two, the plenary talk was about flash fiction, fiction, talking about what is it. We can't seem to agree even on a term to call these shorts. That's another term. And is it a worthwhile form? Is it just a miniature short story, or is it just a short story that's really short? Or is it, again, a whole nother kind of form? Is it a form that's worth writers taking seriously, readers taking seriously, and so on? And people were kind of all over the map on that somewhat. The four speakers who were kind of presenting their perspectives, they were very much advocates of the short or the flash fiction form, microfiction. And again, the word length varies. People don't even agree on when a flash piece starts to become a short story, if those are in fact two different forms. So for their purposes, they kind of define it as 50 to 500 words. That's kind of the range of stuff they're looking at. And like I said, they're very enthusiastic. Talked about the short as almost more like a poem than a short story, which again suggests maybe it is a somewhat different form. Some folks, some writers and scholars there, aren't really fans of the short or the flash piece. I'm not a huge fan myself, quite honestly. I really have never set out to write a flash piece. I've written, a handful of short stories that are pretty darn short, 1,000 to 1,500 words, rarely anything less than that. So, it's not something I've really been a practitioner of, or nor have I really sought out as a reader. An interesting theory. Robert Olen Butler was here. Robert Olen Butler is a famous writer. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993 for A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain. And he's a prolific author. Excuse me, I got to pause this for just a second. Anyway, he's Robert Olen Butler. He's a famous author. Teaches creative writing at Florida State. He's written a book. One of his many, many books. He writes mainly novels and collections of short stories, but he did write a craft book, which I haven't gotten a hold of. I didn't realize he had done that, so I'm going to make sure I get a hold of that. And gosh, the title is not coming to me, but if you look up Robert Olen Butler craft essay book, I'm sure it'll pop right up. But he was talking about the short story and talking about it in sort of Joycean terms. As you know, James Joyce sort of famously coined the idea of the epiphany, that a well-crafted short story, results in the end with the main character having an epiphany, having some realization about something, about themselves or about the world or about someone close to them or whatever. And Butler has modified that and says that a successful short story really needs to have two epiphanies, the Joycean epiphany at the end. But before that, there has to be an epiphany where the central character sort of lays out the groundwork for what the main movement of the story is. And I'm not explaining this very well, but basically Butler says that all fiction is about the search for self. And so in the short story, early on, at some point, not necessarily the first line of the first paragraph, but it should be pretty early in the story, you get a sense of the protagonist's search for self, and then the epiphany at the end is somehow related to that. And it's a really interesting theory, and I haven't really had time to ponder it too much, to think if I completely agree with it, but it is an interesting theory. And so then coming full circle, Butler has suggested that maybe flash fiction is unsatisfying for a lot of readers who otherwise appreciate short fiction because it doesn't have that first epiphany. It's just the one epiphany without the other. Again, very interesting thought, and I'm going to be pondering it on my 30-plus hour trip home, which starts tomorrow. But anyway, that was another highlight of the conference for me, was getting to know Robert Olin Butler, who I've known of for years. And I went to a reading of his in Daytona Beach in 2004, somewhere around in there, which I mentioned to him because we got to chat a little bit, which again was very, very cool. He's as friendly and as funny and as wise as you would want a famous writer to be. It was just a real joy to kind of be in close proximity of him for these 3 days and talk to him several times, just kind of one-on-one, etc. But anywho, I did go to a reading of his many years ago and told him about it. He didn't seem to remember it exactly. There was a snafu with the venue, and they stuck him in this place to do the reading that was wholly inappropriate to give a literary reading, but he, handled it with a plume, and it was a wonderful evening and all those kinds of things. So that was an interesting discussion about flash fiction and about about this idea of the two epiphanies, and maybe one of the issues with flash for those who are not enamored of it may have to do with it on not having both kinds of epiphanies. Within that discussion, there was this wonderful phrase that came up, and I wrote it down because I just love it so much. And the phrase is the incompleteness of the human experience. And it came up in context of people who like flash fiction, both to write it and to read it. They like the incompleteness of it. They like the fact that there's a lot left unsaid. Now, obviously, all fiction, you could have a 1,000-page novel, and there are things that are left unsaid, implied, hinted at, etc. And obviously, in a short story, that oftentimes is the case. But the shorter and shorter and shorter the short story, the more you sort of have to depend on the reader to sort of fill in the blanks. And so there's a lot of mystery associated with flash fiction, particularly. And I wish I knew the woman's name who was, I could maybe figure it out if I did some detective work in the program. But her idea was that in short fiction, that there's an emphasis on the mysterious element, and that it's very much like life itself. Life is incomplete. And kind of along that same line, that some people don't really like short stories either, right? And they complain that you just are getting to know the characters and then they're gone. And again, the lovers of short fiction say, well, that again is a lot like life. We're just getting to know people and then they're gone, right? And so it's a lot of really interesting things to ponder there, philosophically, as well as sort of craft-wise, right? So I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything in that regard. So the prevalence of flash fiction, and we kind of got into the fact that since sort of the internet age, fiction has been getting shorter and shorter and shorter. I started submitting short stories to journals, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago. I can't even remember. And at that time, it was pretty common for journals to routinely be willing to look at 7,000, 8,000 word stories. And then over time, it was like, 5,000 to 6,000 words was kind of the max that most journals kind of wanted to look at. Now it's like 2,000 to 3,000 words. When I go to look for places to send my fiction, one of the problems I always run into is that I still tend to write short fiction that tends to run between 4,000 to 6,000 words. Sometimes it's a little shorter, but oftentimes it's even longer. And it's just hard to find places that are even willing to look at it. It seems like increasingly most journals want to only publish flash fiction or very, very short stories. And why is that? Is that a product of our internet age, and we're not used to reading long textual material, or what's going on there exactly? So we got some discussion of that as well. Let's see here. So I don't know what to do with this. It's just kind of interesting because we read, the yellow wallpaper, and and just about everybody, I think, really, really liked that story, as people have tended to really, really like that story for the last, 120 years or whatever it is. But one of the presentations I went to was by a Filipina professor named Alexandra May Cardoso, and she specializes. She's a professor, but also a playwright, and she specializes in turning English language short stories into stage plays, like one act stage plays in her native languages. Apparently, the Philippines have dozens and dozens, if not more than 100 native languages that are spoken there, but there are some main languages, and so she primarily writes her plays in these two languages and sometimes mixes the languages together. But recently, one of the plays one of the stories rather, she adapted to the stage was The Yellow Wallpaper. Now, unfortunately, you can only see it in the Philippines, and it would be in a language that probably none of us would understand. But it's really, really interesting idea to take that play, or that story rather, and turn it into a stage play, especially one produced in the Philippines in languages that are indigenous to the Philippines, right? So I just, again, not much to do with that, but it's just kind of interesting point. So that's kind of it. Just a really interesting experience. Like I said, just a lot of really fascinating people here from all over the world, but particularly from kind of the Eastern Hemisphere. A lot of folks from Europe, but again, mainly from various countries in Asia and Australia, and so on. There are different narrative styles in the East versus the West, which I think we've talked about in other contexts. And so it was, again, particularly fascinating to interact with these writers who are coming out of these non-Western traditions. It's also amazing the number of non-native English speakers who, of course, not only speak English and can write in English, but they understand it at such a deep level that they do scholarly work, working with English authors, reading in the original, right? So that same presentation that I went to that had the Japanese author analyzing the supernatural elements in Charles Dickens's work had another woman there who was from China, and her specialization was Virginia Woolf. And so she was doing a presentation on 3 of Virginia Woolf's short stories, not one that we're reading in this course. She looked at 3 other Virginia Woolf short stories, but again, I'm always just impressed by anyone who has mastered multiple languages, and people outside the U.S. tend to, have mastered several. So that's always interesting. Got wind of a different conference of a similar focus, a conference on the American short story in particular, which is going to take place in Lisbon in 2025. So I've got the information about that. So if you think, gosh, that'd be kind of fun to go to one of these conferences, and I'd certainly be happy to share the information with you, who to contact to find out more information about that. They haven't put out an official call for papers yet, but they're collecting email addresses to send to people the official call for papers. My wife and I love Lisbon, so we're already excited about the possibility of going to Lisbon in 2025 for this other conference. All right, so I think I'll stop there. We've got just a little bit to go today. We've got, like I said, a luncheon, then we got this really interesting walking tour coming up, and then we're starting back home tomorrow. So I will be in touch, when the jet wheels touch down.